I can't say enough about Dr. Patricia Leavy. I'm so thankful that she's here today. Her wonderful handbook of arts-based research just came out and is for sale right outside. I will read her bio. Dr. Patricia Leavy is an independent scholar and best-selling author. She was formerly Associate Professor of Sociology, Chair of Sociology and Criminology, and Founding Director of Gender Studies at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. She has published 24 books, earning commercial and critical success in both nonfiction and fiction, and her work has been translated into numerous languages. Her recent titles include Research Designs, Quantitative, Qualitative, Mixed Methods, and Arts-Based, and Community-Based Participatory Research Approaches. That's a lot of approaches. Handbook of Arts-Based Research, Method Meets Art, Fiction as Research Practice, the Oxford Handbook of Qualitative Research, and the best-selling novels Blue, American Circumstance, and Low Fat Love. She is also a series creator and editor of 7 book series with Oxford University Press and Neuroscience, including a groundbreaking social fiction series, and is a co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of Art Research International, a transdisciplinary journal. A vocal advocate of public scholarship, she blogs for the Huffington Post, The Creative Post, and We Are the Real Deal, and is frequently called on by U.S. national news media. In addition to receiving numerous accolades of her books, she has received career awards for the New England Sociological Association, the American Creativity Association, the American Educational Research Association, the International Congress of Qualitative Research, and the National Arts Education Association. In 2016, Mogul, a global women's empowerment network, named her an influencer. And recently, she was honored by the National Women's Hall of Fame. Personally, when I was doing my dissertation research, Method Meets Arts was quintessential in terms of getting started. And arts-based research was kind of a breeze in the wind at another conference presentation that I saw many years ago. And there wasn't a lot out there in 2010 when I was doing my dissertation. There was at least, that was really visible. And Method Meets it's right here actually. Method Meets Art was really right at the forefront of helping me get started. And since then, it's really blossomed. And so it's a distinct honor to welcome you here with us today. Thank you. So we're going to sit down and talk, have a conversation. So if you can't see us, come on over. Huddle, huddle. Well, I do have some questions. One of the things I've been fascinated with in arts-based research is all of our narratives coming into it. There's creative arts therapists, there are art educators, there are social workers. It seems like there are a lot of people coming here into arts-based research, naming things, entering into new territories. And I was wondering about your particular history and how you came into arts-based research.
Thank you for the introduction and for having me here. And before I answer your question, I want to say something I'm sure everybody here is thinking, which is thank you for putting on this event. And also, so I don't have to thank them, but we all want to thank you. And this image is perfect, and the team speech is perfect because it reminds us how especially important taking the time to put on an event like this is at this historical moment. So I'm sure I speak for everyone that we're very grateful to you for all of your efforts. So thank you. So my background, growing up, I always loved the arts and I was involved in arts. I loved creative writing since I was very little. I took dance classes for 14 years. When I was in high school, I was in a theater company. My big claim to fame was that I was in a public service announcement. That ran on cable TV, which is a very big deal back in the day. And I was very involved in arts, but then ultimately I did not pursue the arts in any way as a profession. And I ended up studying sociology. And my bachelor's, master's, and PhD are all in sociology. So the arts was sort of something I did on the weekends and in my spare time, but I wanted to be a sociologist. And I think a lot of people who go into sociology or any of the social sciences really have this idea that they want to be of some use in the world. You want to do something good. At least when you're 18 to 22, that's the idea of going into the field, that you want to in some way be useful and in some way improve society through your work. So that was my idea. And when I was getting my PhD, I started publishing. When I was in graduate school, I published my first articles and even my first book. So I started publishing early on. And I was doing what I thought was interesting research. I was interviewing women about their lives. So about their gender identities, their romantic relationships, their family relationships, self-esteem issues, body image, all of this sort of thing. And I was publishing my work in the ways that you're taught to publish your work in academia. And at some point, I had this sort of panic moment of, does anybody read this stuff? Like, truly. I mean, I was spending years doing research with other people, using all of the resources we had, just including our own time, and imposing on others to get their stories, to collect data from them. And I really had this sort of like epiphany moment of, this is a legitimate question. Is anybody reading any of this stuff? And it turned out, no, nobody was reading it, and nobody's reading most of it. And I started to do a little research, and I found some shocking statistics. For example, in the social sciences and humanities, 90% of peer-reviewed journal articles, 90%, have an audience of 3 to 8 readers. Let's really just stop and pause on that. And 3 to 8 readers. And I actually have to say, I think that's an overestimated figure. I mean, legitimately I do. The reason I do is because the way they calculate those figures is based either on downloads or citations. And anyone who's an academic knows you can cite something without having read more than the abstract. And you can certainly download something without even reading the abstract. So the 3 to 8 is probably a high number. But basically nobody's reading this stuff. And also among the 3 to 8, you'll love this, they count the author of the article, the journal editor, and the author's mentor. So this is how desperate we are to claim we have readership, that we count ourselves among our own readers. So I found out, very few peer-reviewed articles have an audience, are read. And then obviously, even when they are read, those few that do pick up an audience, they pick up a purely academic audience. So we are speaking solely to our peers. Peer-reviewed articles are 100% inaccessible to anyone outside of the academy. They just are. First of all, they are only in university libraries. There's nobody else in the world who's even aware of them, nor has access to them. And they're very expensive to get if you don't have a university library card that allows you access to these things. On top of which they're written in a way that, a New York Times columnist described as gobbledygook. But they're written with jargon. They're written so a few of your peers can understand them, and basically nobody else can. My favorite quote of all time, which I think you'll appreciate, it's by Eric Gerson, and it's, "Hell is sitting on a hot stone reading your own scientific publications." I think it's right on. So at some point, sort of early on, at the end of graduate school, once I've been publishing, and then early in my career, I started having these questions. Does anybody read this work? Is it good anyway? In my own work, I became very critical of, I'm really working hard to write these articles and conference papers, but do they even capture the essence of the women's stories who I interviewed? And how do I deal ethically with the fact that women like the ones I interviewed would never have access to the findings in any real way? So I started to think about how else might we do research. And I started doing a lot of research about research. I had a mentor at the time who was a methodologist. And we started doing a lot of explorations in what she called emergent research methods, so, you know, innovative research methods. And it was through that research that I stumbled across arts-based research. I didn't even know what it was called at the time. I have all these early folders from back in the day where all the articles I said they were creative methods. They have these tabs on them, creative methods. And then at some point I stumbled across the actual term arts-based research. And so I started to think about, you know, what different shapes might our research take? And how might those shapes actually shape the knowledge that we produce? And that's what led me on a path to arts-based research.
Thank you. Yes. We're glad you're here. I was, you know, as you described in your story, you know, I feel like the various roles, one thing that I've loved about arts-based research is that it really helped integrate me as a clinician, as a researcher, as an artist and musician, as a lover of music, and so I felt whole within it. I didn't say, well, I'm a quantitative researcher by day, and I'm a clinician. You know, the world seemed very separate, so I felt like that. But I'm always playing, when should I be more researcher than artist, or when should I be more artist than researcher, or, you know, in various settings. And so my ideas of arts-based research seem to shift and expand over time, as do my roles. And I'm wondering how you have navigated those roles over the past 15 years, and how your ideas of arts-based research has shifted over that time period.
And you know, what you just described, I think, is probably what a lot of people who either go into research from an arts perspective have, or come into the arts from a research perspective. I mean, ultimately, you end up having multiple lenses, which is this incredible gift, because you can look at whatever it is that you're looking at it through multiple lenses. But, you know, and I think a lot of us probably also relate to the idea that our work and our interests were compartmentalized before we found ways to integrate these things, and I absolutely relate to that. I mean, I spent every weekend my entire life engaged in the arts, but then the weekday was engaged in something else, and these were completely separate activities. But for me, I mean, I guess I would start by saying how I see arts-based research and what I see arts-based research as. So for me, I see arts-based research as a set of methodological tools that adapt the tenets of the creative arts, but can be used to address social research questions in any field, in any discipline. And I've seen people use arts-based research in neuroscience, in physics, in medicine, and so I really do mean in any field, even though it's still more common in the humanities and social sciences, it could be any field. And when I say methodological tools, I think that arts-based research can be used for any stage or all stages of the research process. So it could be used for data collection or data generation, or however you choose to term that process, data analysis, and/or representation. So I don't know where everybody is in their arts-based journey, and under the assumption there are students in the room, I just want to go through a few examples of what those are so we all have a working definition, at least my definition of how I see arts-based research. So if you're using arts-based research for data generation, that could happen in a couple of ways. It could happen where you are using the art-making experience literally as the generation process, as the process of inquiry. So, you know, you are creating the art, that is your process of discovery. Or it could be something that resembles much more the research, traditional research side of the continuum. Because there's really a continuum with arts-based research, from a very artistic approach to a much more scientific approach. And many points in between, and so all of our practices might fall at different points on that continuum. So another way that you could use arts-based research for data generation would be to do some sort of participatory study. So for example, if you wanted to study about something about life in middle school, you might go into middle schools, get students who are your participants, and instead of doing in-depth interviews with them or something of that nature, you have them engage in art making. And there have been many studies like that. So maybe they're creating art that's meant to describe their school experience, how they feel in school, whatever it might be. So you could use APR for data generation, data collection. You can use arts-based research for data analysis. And again, these are just examples that can happen in innumerable ways, but I did a project with a creative arts therapist named Victoria Scotti, where I had done traditional qualitative interviews. And I sent her those interviews and summaries of those interviews. And then through her analysis phase, for each of the participants, she created what she called a visual concept. And it was a visual portrait, if you will, that embodied the themes from the interviews. I then took those visual concepts and then started to interpret them and ended up writing the findings based on those concepts. So, and then there was another stage of painting as well. But the point is that the art was used for analysis. It was an analysis tool. And then, most commonly, people think of arts-based research as a way to represent their research, which is one of the reasons I want to go through all the ways, because it's not just a representational form, it's also a way of knowing. But so you could do a study of any kind, say an interview study, and then you write up a play, you write up an ethnodrama. You may or may not perform that ethnodrama. That would be the representation stage. And then, of course, you could use arts-based research for all of those stages. So I see arts-based research as a set of methodological tools that adapt the tenets of the creative arts in order to address research questions and can be used at any or all phases of the research process. Now, over my 15 years or so doing this, I've always seen ABR that way. However, what that means has changed to me over time as I've learned more and more, and learned probably the biggest thing that any of us can learn is how little we know yet, and how much more there is to know. I mean, everywhere I go, everywhere I do a talk and speak to people, I learn something else about what arts-based research can do that I didn't know before. But when I initially came to ABR 15 years ago, I saw arts-based research as an expansion of qualitative research, which I think is still how a lot of people see ABR, so I think there are different schools of thought. So I really have been trained as a mostly qualitative researcher, so I saw arts-based tools as, you know, basically new qualitative methods. Whereas now, 15 years later, I don't. I see arts-based research as its own paradigm with its own philosophical underpinning and its own approach to research. And for that matter, I see community-based research the same way. Some people look at community-based research as a set of tools within qualitative research, but I don't. I see it as its own paradigm that is also employed by quantitative researchers and has a rich history in quantitative research. So that's one big difference between when I began and now. Another thing that I'm seeing is that people feel a lot more free to experiment. And notwithstanding the particular historical moment we're in, and there's no getting around the fact that the arts and artists are under attack, which, if you're a glass half full person, you can look at that as an incredible opportunity, which is exactly how I look at it. I mean, what we are doing is needed. We have lots of material to draw on. I mean, if you don't have inspiration in these times, I'm not quite sure when we'll find it. And there are so many of us, I mean, truly, and throughout the world. I mean, I'm in a global network of people throughout the world, both artists and arts researchers, who are all feeling that they want to use the tools they have to create positive change, whatever that might be, and to resist in whatever way they feel is appropriate. The fact that there is such a rich energy in our global community to do that, to me, is an incredible opportunity. So I try and look at the opportunity side of it, because we're stuck with the downside anyway. I mean, we've got that part of it. So what's the opportunity part? And the opportunity part is that we can really collectively pool our energy and resources because people are feeling that they want to. And another thing, a final thing I'll say, that over the last 15 years, when I looked at ABR 15 years ago, when I was writing the proposal for the first edition of Method Meets Art, which thank you for your kind words, when I was writing that proposal, and there was only one other book on arts-based research at that time, and it was not a research methods book, and every publisher in the world thought I was crazy. And I was writing that proposal, I saw arts-based research very much as a way to make the research we were already doing more useful. And I still see that as a possibility. But what I see 15 years later are all of the questions you can ask and answer with the arts that you couldn't have without them. So I see it as a process of discovery much more. So it's not just about taking your research and making it useful, but it's also about discovering things that you never would have discovered in your research. I mean, I was doing the same interviews nearly 20 years ago, which is what led to all of this in the first place. I'm still doing those interviews. But now, when I write them up and I use fiction and other tools like that, I see things in them. I literally learn things about the interviews that I didn't before. So I'm learning that it's its own perspective, it's its own paradigm, it has its own philosophy, and it is a different kind of process of discovery.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. You know, in qualitative research, you know, there's phenomenology, ethnography. There's a handful of designs. In quantitative research, there's a handful of designs. In the handbook of arts-based research, we have cartoonists. You know, we have artists, we have musicians. You know, it seems to me that the designs in arts-based research are endless because it's about craft and it's about, you know, an artist's vision and how they view the world. And so that's why I love the handbook of arts-based research, because it shows that there's not just one, you know, handful of ways. There's a spectrum of ways to engage in this. So it really is exciting. You know, you started talking about the contribution of artists and researchers, artists as researchers, researchers as artists, to, you know, knowledge that's vital within the 21st century, especially regarding some of the social issues that are facing us today. What do you see arts-based research role, or just even the artist's role, in addressing neoconservative values within research, within patriarchal structures such as university settings, or for creative arts therapists in hospital settings, and you know, and social injustices in our society?
I mean, first of all, I think that all research has a value system underpinning it. So whether people discuss it openly or not, every time we do research, there is some value system guiding it, whatever that value system might be. One of the things I love about arts-based research is we tend to make that very explicit and to really engage with what that value system is. But I think there's always a value system guiding research, and I think the researcher should always be aware of what the value system is that's guiding their research. What is the significance of doing research on that topic? What possible good will it do? Who will it do good for? How will this research benefit people? All of those kinds of questions are always guiding the research process. And then when I look at arts-based research, and you know, for me personally, and this is a question that each researcher has to answer for themselves, but I think when I start to think about what is the purpose of doing research, what is the significance, who might it benefit, regardless of what kind of approach to research I'm using, I also start to think about, you know, what are we doing for the greater good? We have enormous resources relative to most people in the world. If you are working with an MFA or a PhD and you're working in a university setting, regardless of all of the kinds of challenges that we might have in terms of educational resources, resources of time to commit to issues we're interested in, engage in work we like, we have so much relative to most people. So to what end do we put all of those resources? And for me, I think that there is an ethical obligation to at least attempt to do work that is of value to someone beyond yourself. So it has to be of value to something beyond the line on the CV, even though there are institutional structures that people have to negotiate in order to earn a living and all of that. So what does it mean to do research that's of some value? So you have to decide what that value is. I mean, I am a big proponent of social justice in all forms and using your work to promote social justice and social equality. But that's my version of how research should operate. There are lots of different versions of how research should operate. One of the amazing things about the arts, which you've touched on and Nadine touched on, and I love having this image because this image touches on too, is that by nature, what arts-based researchers have, that researchers in other paradigms don't have is that by nature, the arts have a resistive quality. We are already partly there. I mean, that is one of the things that makes the arts so powerful, is that they can jar you into seeing something differently. They can jar you into feeling something deeply that what this is picking up on, I mean, I didn't know this was going to be up here, but it couldn't be more fabulous. What this is picking up on is making us all feel something we already feel. I mean, that's why it resonates. This particular example, we could put up examples that might make us feel something new, and that's a wonderful thing too. But what this is tapping into, and why it went viral, in my estimation, is because it is tapping into something that we all know, whether or not we can all name it, and whether or not we would all come up with the same name to name it. We all feel something similar, probably, when we look at this. And that is powerful. I mean, that is really powerful. Putting this image up speaks more volumes, probably, than anything I'm going to say here holding a microphone, even in an informal keynote scenario, and that is the power of art. And we all know that. And so the great thing about the kind of research that we're all engaged in is that it already has a resistive quality built in. Now, how you choose to channel that is up to you and your research agenda. It might be, as I've done in my work, to challenge patriarchal structures. It might be to challenge other issues. It might be to challenge the current administration or any other administration. It might be to challenge trends in fascism that we're seeing on a global level. I mean, it could be many different things. But the ability to do it is already embodied in the very practices we're using. That's really my point. Because the arts by nature, I mean by design, can jar people into thinking differently, can resonate, can connect on an emotional level, can create micro, macro links so that we can look at one person's individual story and connect it to something much larger in our culture. The arts already do all of those things. So when it comes to putting the arts in service of social justice or whatever it might be, which I do believe we have an obligation to do, but when it comes to doing that, we have a leg up over other ways of doing research. And I'm a proponent of all ways of doing research. I mean, you know, as Mike mentioned, I've written about quantitative research, which I think is very useful for certain things. I've written about qualitative research, very useful for certain things. But the arts are useful for a host of other things. And partly what you said before is just the sheer number of methods available. I mean, quantitative research, you can count the methods on the fingers on your hand. And that's fine. Those methods are really useful for a small range of things. But the arts, it's just endless genres and combinations. And then when you combine them with other methodological practices too, it really is just sort of an infinite set of tools. And that's how I think of methods, as tools. And you know, imagine if you buy a condo and you decide to go to the hardware store and you decide to buy one tool. So you buy a hammer. And all you have in your condo, anytime anything breaks, is a hammer. Every once in a while, you'll be in luck. That hammer will serve you well. But, you know, if your toilet won't flush, your hammer's not going to help you. If you can't open a jar, your hammer's not going to help you. There are all kinds of things where you need other tools. And, you know, when you think of a toolbox, quantitative research gives you a few tools. Qualitative research gives you even more tools than that. Then when you look at arts-based research, I mean, you're not going to be able to shut that toolbox anymore because there are so many possibilities.
Yeah, I was wondering about evaluation, you know, when being a journal reviewer in arts-based research gets sent to a journal and I'm engaging in someone's artwork and I don't have much context for the person's artistry, so I'm not sure how the artwork responds and how I'm responding to it and how I evaluate that for an academic journal. There's some questions that I have regarding evaluation, and I was performing my arts-based research study and taking surveys, seeing how people evaluated it, purposely not giving them context over time. So the first performance I gave, I really gave very little context. And in a lot of ways, the survey responses I got, the written responses were, you know, a lot of them were very pleasant, but my favorite ones were the ones that I had no idea what was happening. I had no idea where the sounds were coming from. I don't know what you were doing. And it was those responses. And at first I thought, and then I thought, well, that's right. There's something about that. And so I thought, well, those are actually the responses I want. I want the ones that are honestly just like are wondering, why did you make me feel this way? But then that left a lot of questions for me about how we evaluate arts-based research. And I was wondering, if you could speak to that in terms of how our roles as artists and researchers to disseminate the knowledge and what that leaves folks in terms of what we do.
Yeah, it's and I feel for you having to evaluate this stuff for a journal, because I do it for book series. I mean, literally 7 days a week for the last 7 years, people have been sending me their novels, their plays, their poetry collections. And I'm not a poet, I'm not a playwright, so I literally am not in those genres. So I feel for that task. So, look, there are lists of criteria that you can use to evaluate research, but for me, there are a couple of things that I really look at in the end, which might speak to what you're thinking about. And one of them is, what is that art good for? That's the number one question I ask with everything I receive. I mean, every single submission I receive to anything arts-based I do. And just for my own pleasure. I mean, I read arts-based work, I view, consume arts-based work. And, art is very subjective anyway. I mean, we could have a long discussion, and if there's any art historians here, I'm sure they would speak to this better than I will, but you could have a long discussion about, what work ends up in museums and gets regarded as the great work anyway. What is that process like? And who was around making these decisions and involved in these decisions when they were made? And who was excluded from those decisions? And how might that influence what we see as good and not good? And we have discussions about, well, that's just aesthetically strong. Well, where did those criteria come from in the first place? So it's all problematic anyway. I mean, it's always problematic in some ways, evaluating and judging art. Whether it's novels or hanging in a museum, and there's always a historical context for how that happened. And so, as an arts-based researcher who really is a sociologist and not coming at it from an arts perspective, I think, what right do I have to judge someone's art beyond the way we all do when we look at a museum and we personally like something and we personally don't, and we're able to recognize that's merely personal preference. Like if we go to a movie with a friend and they love the movie and we hate the movie, we're probably able to realize it's because that's personal preference. So beyond that, what can we do? And I look at a couple of things. The number one thing I look at is, what is that art good for? So if they're doing it as arts-based research, so whether it's a journal or a novel or a short film or whatever it is, they're doing it in some context. They had some research purpose. So how well does this art contribute to that research purpose? How well can I see the link between those things? Does it aid what they're trying to do? That's one thing I look at. The second thing I look at, which is honestly how I make all of my editorial decisions, is the voice. The voice of the artist researcher. Does a unique voice come out? I mean, every piece of art should have the artist's fingerprint. Every piece of art. At any stage you're at, when you're a student, look, any of us who are parents, and I know you have a new baby, but you also have a 7-year-old, so you know this. And I'm a mom, so I know this. Your child comes home at some time when they're like 5 years old. They come home from school with a piece of art. It was either finger paint, and it's like 8 colors that all become brown, so it looks like poo. Or the art teacher have them cut a potato in half or something and do potato prints on a page, whatever it is. And everybody hangs that up on their refrigerator. If you're a good parent, you hang it up on your refrigerator. But if you go to your child's classroom and you see 24 kids and they all have their little poo paintings or whatever it might be, they do look different. You can see your child's. And in your heart, you like it the best. But you can see it. I mean, everybody has their own fingerprint. Even the way little kids color in coloring books, and those who stay in the lines and those who go out of the lines, every artist has a fingerprint. And certainly by the time you're an adult and making adult art, whether you're writing a novel or creating a play, I mean, you know, the two of us could sit together with the same theme, the same set of interview transcripts, and be asked to write just a character profile on one person, we will come up with totally different things. Even just the tenor of it, whether or not we use humor, whatever it might be. So we all have our own voice. So when I'm trying to evaluate arts-based research, you know, like I said, there's a set of criteria. You can look at the handbook, and Method Meets Art, or many other people have now written books about this. They also have their own criteria. But I look at, what is this piece of art or research useful for? How is it useful? And I look at, you know, is there a voice? You know, will I remember this 5 minutes after I've consumed it? You know, because when there's a voice, you do. And when you're getting these manuscripts every day, you see very quickly. You know, and sometimes you see people trying to write like somebody else. You see that kind of thing, or you feel like that's what they're trying to do because they haven't quite found their voice. And, you know, I'm a big believer that a mediocre novel with a strong point of view is better than somebody else's attempt to sound like somebody else. If you have your own voice, if it's somehow unique, you use your own word structure, you have your own sense of humor, whatever it is, those things make something engaging. And when the work is engaging, people will remember it and then hopefully actually learn whatever the set of things you want them to learn from it is. Sure.
Yeah, I want to talk about a little bit more specifically about your work, and especially what has inspired your work. You know, I feel like the nonfiction series, like Low Fat Love, I said that right? For some reason. Yeah, Low Fat Love. You know, the nonfiction series has as much truth in it as it does a fiction series. You know, what we learn from something that's nonfiction, for me, stands out as an important truth to take away. And I was just wondering, from within your own work, you know, can you talk about it a little bit more from a lot of the themes we've already discussed, such as challenging patriarchal structures and you know, the social injustices of today, and talk a little bit about what has inspired the nonfiction series in particular, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look, the interesting thing about the ideas of fiction and nonfiction is that we look at them as a binary, or a lot of people look at them as binary, which really is not true at all. I mean, it's a slippery slope. It's a continuum at best. I mean, there's no fiction that isn't grounded in nonfiction realities. I mean, really. I mean, you know, even Harry Potter. I mean, J.K. Rowling, if her mother hadn't died, we wouldn't have some of these, you know, Demento characters. Because that is just the form in which she chose to describe her grief and how she was feeling. All fiction is grounded in the real world in some way, and as an author, it comes through each of our filters. So I'm a big believer that you can learn as much or more from fiction or from any art form as you can from nonfiction. And I think many of us have had that experience. I mean, you go to a movie and you learn something, you go to a play and you learn something, you read a novel and you learn something. You know, you read a novel and you can imagine what it's like to live in another culture in a way that you otherwise could not, that you can't get from a nonfiction article. So in my own work, so this cycles right back to your first question and how I got here in the first place. And I had been doing this interview research for years, as I mentioned earlier, with women about their lives, and became completely frustrated with the only ways I was told that I could share that research. And so I had a sabbatical at one point, and I decided, you know, I'm going to do some creative writing. I'm going to take out all my notes from the last 9 years, and I'm just going to do some creative writing. It was actually meant to be like a personal vomit, to be honest. I never meant to publish it. I never meant it to be a career. I never told anybody about it. It was just to like release it. And I had also been frustrated over the years in my classes. I taught very intimate classes about gender and sexuality, and students shared their personal experience inside and outside of class with me. So I felt like I had these cumulative insights from both the interviews and my teaching, and just absolutely nowhere to put them. So I started writing, and at first I thought it would be a poem, then I thought it would be a short story, and then it became a novel. And the only person in the world who knew about it was he's now my husband, which partly because he told me to publish a novel, so I decided I'd marry him. So thank you, Mark. That is the truth. The day he told me to write it as a novel, he read the first 20 pages, and the day he said, you should write a novel, I told my mother I'm going to marry him. But anyway, I don't know if you know that. But it's the truth. But so I literally just took my sabbatical, and I wrote the things that had most frustrated me over 9 years of doing interviews and over 12 years of teaching. And at that time, the things that had most frustrated me was that the majority of the women that I had interviewed with had identities that were deeply grounded in their relationships with men. Not always romantic relationships, but in their relationships with men. And often these were toxic relationships. And their identities were so linked to them. And I had one turning point interview where I asked this woman something about her boyfriend because she mentioned her boyfriend up front. And then she went on to tell me what I think she thought the correct answer in an interview was, which was that, my identity is not linked to my boyfriend at all. Okay, so, and then I'm wondering what kind of relationship it is. Okay, so not linked at all. Then for the entire interview, I read this transcript 3 times to make sure I wasn't just hearing things in my head. There was not a single sentence that was not we for an hour. So how is it, even she could not talk about her own life without talking about him. And it was no matter what I asked. I mean, it was just fascinating. But I had hundreds of interviews that had different versions of this. And people settling for relationships that were not really what they wanted because they didn't think they could get what they really wanted, or settling in other areas of life, in school, in jobs they had, with friends they had, because they didn't think they could get what they wanted, so they made compromises. And look, over a decade, this bummed me out, to be honest. I really felt like, and I could relate, I mean, especially from my younger years, having made some of those choices myself. So I had empathy for these women. But it really bummed me out, and I came to think of this whole thing through this sort of concept of low-fat love, which is sort of like, I can't believe it's not butter, only relationships. It's like, I can't believe it's not butter. And it's fine to eat that product, it's okay, but we don't have to pretend it's something it's not. And when you do it in a relationship, I think it's worse. And when you do it in a relationship with yourself, I think that's the very worst. So I came up with this idea of low-fat love. I wrote this novel, never intended to publish it. Mark told me to publish it. So I thought about, how do I publish it? And, to get to your question about challenging patriarchal structures, what I wanted to do in that novel, even though I thought nobody would read it, but what I wanted to do for myself was to start out with this sort of very traditional chick lit sort of format that the standard demographic would be like a 20-year-old reading it on an airplane or on a beach. Start out with that genre and then subvert it from within. So, you don't get any of the endings that you would get in that. You don't get the journey you would get in that. People who really love that genre actually probably hate the book quite a bit. But the idea was to subvert it from within, from a feminist point of view. So that was the concept. So when I finished writing it, and I did decide I wanted to publish it, I had no idea, how do you publish it? I had only written academic books. How do you publish a novel? And the traditional ways, you get a literary agent and you go to a trade publisher. But I wanted it to count as research. And it was important to me for a range of reasons that it counted as research. So over a period of months, I ended up stewing on it, coming up with the idea for the social fiction series, and that it would have to be bigger than my own novel. And that's how that series of problem solving is how that series developed. And now we have 26 titles in that series, many of which are bestsellers, and novels, plays, you name it. But for me, that's how it started. But, I'm glad you asked this question for this reason. This is what I learned from Low-Fat Love, and everything I've done since Low-Fat Love, is the power of arts-based research. When I released that novel, I've never in my life had an experience like that experience. And I had probably published at least 10 books before that, just so you know. So this was not my first rodeo in terms of publishing my work. But I've never had anything like that. I was bombarded with emails from readers. To this day, I get emails regularly from readers about that book. I was bombarded everywhere I went, every university I went to speak at, if I went to a conference, after a book talk, people will literally stand in line to whisper their own story to me. That's my point. And to this day, I've had women follow me into ladies' rooms, which is awkward. It's not the best place to share your stories. But literally, people would stand in line to whisper their stories. I still get emails to this day. I went and spoke at one university where the dean, I can't say the name of the place, where the dean wanted to take me out for coffee. I said, sure. The dean wanted to spend an hour telling me about their history with alcoholism and all this other stuff because they read Low Fat Love. Just everywhere I went, I realized it became a springboard for people to reflect on their own lives. I had people emailing me, telling me it prevented them from committing suicide. I had professors telling me that students went to them and told them that they had been suicidal. I mean, way beyond what anyone could ever imagine they would experience. And then subsequently, when I released my other novels, I had similar experiences, although it was the strongest with Low Fat Love. But my last novel, Blue, I had a very strong reaction, different, but it was from students who were trying to figure out the next phase of their lives, or people who had graduated a couple years earlier and then they read that book and then they emailed me to tell me, this made me quit my job, or this made me apply to graduate school, or the power to connect with people in their lives, to create lasting learning. I know that we're running out of time soon, but my latest obsession for the last several years, which if you leave with anything from this, you can go Google this later, is that I'm absolutely obsessed with the neuroscience of creativity, which I actually believe will be a huge part of the future of our field moving forward and the work that we're doing moving forward. But there's one area in particular, and this is how neuroscientists basically study your brains on art or your brains making art. Okay? So in a nutshell. And the research is unbelievable. There's one field that has sort of been dubbed literary neuroscience, which speaks to how people consume fiction versus nonfiction. And it's just incredible. I mean, there are these studies where they have people do, they read Jane Austen novels and then they read a nonfiction book, and they do brain scans while they're reading. And what they find is that when people are like what they're reading and it's fiction, that they become so immersed that parts of the brain are activated that we didn't think had anything to do with reading and that are not activated when we're reading nonfiction. So including sensory parts. So things that are associated in our brain with touch, for example, are activated if we're immersed in reading fiction. I mean, this is fascinating. There are many, many studies that show this. So, that feeling when you're reading like a novel and you have to read one more chapter even though it's late, or, or like you can't believe the plane landed because you're at a good, or, the house could burn down and you might not notice, or someone's calling you, or you forget to eat something. All of that, you're actually having a different physiological experience. Your body is having a different experience than when you read nonfiction. So I think about that when I think about the reactions to Low Fat Love and to my later novels. And Low Fat Love to me is a mediocre novel at best. And I mean that truly. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing. The best thing I'll say about it, it was raw and it was honest because I didn't know what I was doing, but it's not like the best novel you're ever going to read, and yet it inspired this response. And I think it's because it resonated with people's experiences. They saw themselves reflected in it in a way that they never would from a lecture. I could stand at the podium right now and give you a lecture about the interview research I've done now for almost 15 years. And I don't think you'd remember it by the time you get to lunch. Probably not by the time you get to the next session. But if you read, it doesn't have to be my fiction, but if you read any fiction that you're interested in on that topic, you might remember those characters years later. You might feel something for them years later. When you finish the novel, it might stay with you as you go on into your activities, as that has happened with all of us with fiction that we love. So it's through writing my own novels that I realized the power of these methods. I mean, they are truly, truly powerful. And then I realized that we can start to evoke the change we want to create, because I've seen it just on this sort of micro level of those people who have shared their experiences with me. I mean, people making real changes to their lives after reading something. Now, I don't believe for a minute that the novel caused them to make those changes. I believe those changes are things they wanted to do anyway, and the novel empowered them to do it. Or the novel was the last straw, or it was one thing in a series of things that pushed them to do it. But if you take that away, would they have done it? So I think that it's just the power we have. I mean, I see people now too, like on social media and stuff, saying, you know, don't settle for low-fat love, or, you know, whatever it is. And I'm like, well, it's like a thing, like, but
Hashtag low-fat love.
But can you imagine, like, the best journal article title in the world creating that response, where people then say to their friends, don't settle for low-fat love, and the friend knows what it means, and maybe that becomes a part of his or her or their decision-making. And so that is really powerful to me. And that is on a really, really small scale, relative to what some other people have done with their arts-based research.
Yeah, thank you. I want to take a moment to surprise our keynote speaker, because her pioneering work, we really, and it's because of Shaylin, who actually started the idea, the impetus of it. But she's amazing, by the way.
Amazing.
Well, the School of Fine and Performing Arts would like to honor Dr. Patricia Leavy for her pioneering work in arts research and social justice. And what we really have wanted to do was to start a student award here in honor of Patricia. So Patricia Leavy Arts and Social Justice Award. But I would like to present our keynote speaker with a plaque to honor her for her pioneering research